Prejudice often hides behind polished doors, but inside a luxury jewelry store one afternoon, that hidden ugliness would be dragged into the light. What began as a false accusation against a black woman browsing quietly among the displays would ignite a chain of events that shattered a corrupt network from the inside out. Neither the customer who called her out nor the officer who handcuffed her realized that the woman they targeted was the highest-ranking SWAT commander in the state, trained to lead, built to fight, and ready to tear down every lie they thought would protect them. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The air inside the Sutton and Vale jewelers carried the soft chill of conditioned luxury, a contrast to the warm afternoon sun outside. The scent of polished wood, fresh-cut lilies, and the faint metallic whisper of cold cash lingered in the air, mingling with the low hum of private conversations and the clink of crystal display cases being closed and locked. The floors gleamed like poured milk, smooth and unblemished beneath the sharp shine of designer shoes. Each light overhead was carefully angled, scattering reflections across diamond necklaces, sapphire rings, and watches priced higher than most people's homes. The walls, covered in cream silk wallpaper, seemed to drink in every whisper, but echo the sound of heels tapping with soft authority. Commander Nia Lawson moved through the aisles without hurry, her presence calm, composed, almost too effortless for the space she occupied. She wore a crisp, tailored navy blouse tucked neatly into dark jeans, clean lines and understated elegance, a crossbody leather bag resting at her hip. Her short, natural curls framed a face that bore the quiet strength of someone accustomed to navigating rooms where she was seen but not truly welcomed. She paused at a case displaying a delicate tennis bracelet, white gold, a lattice of diamonds woven so finely it looked like silk. She admired it without touching the glass, her hands folded behind her back. Her expression remained neutral, unreadable to the clerks who eyed her with polite tension, their smiles just a little too tight, their glances flickering a beat too long to be courteous. Across the room, Marla DeWitt noticed her. Marla, swaddled in an ivory cashmere wrap and clutching a designer handbag, peered over the top of her sunglasses, her lips tightening. She was the kind of woman who believed her opinion was law, and that law had never been challenged. Her gaze swept Nia from head to toe, searching for the thread of difference, the justification to wrap her judgment around. She leaned closer to a nearby clerk, whispering, not so low that it couldn't be heard. "Keep an eye on that one," Marla murmured, her voice edged with false concern. "You know how these types can be." The clerk gave a nervous laugh, casting another glance toward Nia, as if Marla's words gave permission for suspicion to bloom. Nia felt it, of course. The way the room shifted, the invisible rope drawing tighter around her shoulders. It was a feeling she knew well. Not new, not surprising, but always bitter when it surfaced. Still, she remained where she was, breathing in slow, steady rhythms, giving no outward sign that she had noticed. She moved along the display case, admiring the pieces with the detached grace of a woman who had seen true treasures in her lifetime. Treasures worth far more than baubles behind glass. Marla watched her, phone sliding smoothly into her hand. She opened a live-stream app without hesitation, tilting the camera just enough to capture Nia in the frame without appearing obvious. Her voice took on a sticky sweetness as she spoke to her viewers. "Just here shopping, but look at this. Hope Security's paying attention," she said, her tone light but loaded. Nia caught the whisper of her voice, the unnatural tilt of the air again. She glanced toward Marla, expression still unreadable, then returned her gaze to the case. The store manager, a man in an impeccable gray suit, noticed the rising tension. His eyes flicked to Marla, then to Nia. A decision formed behind his gaze, brittle and safe. Not for what was right, but for what was easy. He stepped away quietly toward the entrance, his voice low into a headset. Moments later, the door opened, and Officer Trent Maddox walked in. He wore his uniform like armor, swagger rolling off his broad shoulders. His blonde hair was cropped close, his jaw set with the permanent grimace of a man who believed the world owed him deference. His hand rested near his belt as he scanned the store, eyes locking almost immediately onto Nia. The manager gestured subtly. Maddox nodded once, understanding without words. He approached with heavy, deliberate steps, the kind meant to be heard before they were seen. "Excuse me, ma'am," Maddox said, his voice loud enough to capture the attention of every customer in earshot. "I'm going to need you to come with me for a few questions." Heads turned. Conversations stilled. Even the delicate clinking of jewelry seemed to cease. Nia turned slowly to face him. She said nothing at first, letting the silence hang, forcing him to hear it. "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice calm, almost gentle. Maddox smirked, as if the very act of questioning him was insolence. "We have a report of suspicious behavior," he said. His hand hovered near the cuffs at his belt. Just cooperating would be best for everyone. Behind him, Marla's phone was still rolling, her smile wide and triumphant. The store staff shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between Maddox and Nia, none brave enough to speak. Nia glanced around, measuring the room, measuring the stakes. And though she knew she could end this in a sentence, reveal her authority, she chose instead to see how far they were willing to go. For the truth was not in their words, but in their actions. And already, it was speaking louder than anything else. The room seemed to hold its breath as Maddox stepped closer, the slight creak of his boots against marble slicing through the growing murmur of the crowd. Nia didn't move. Her arms remained at her sides, palms open, fingers relaxed. But Marla DeWitt took that stillness for guilt, her voice rising in a syrupy, saccharine pitch as she addressed her phone's growing audience. "There she is," Marla said, loud enough now for the entire store to hear. "Caught red-handed, trying to slip that bracelet right into her bag. They think we're not watching, but we are." Several heads turned fully now, customers pausing mid-purchase, clerks stiffening behind their counters. The manager hovered near the entrance, avoiding eye contact, his expression rigid. He would not intervene. Maddox's jaw tightened as he glanced at Marla, nodding subtly as if confirming an unspoken alliance. "Let's make this easy," he said to Nia, resting his hand on the butt of his baton. "Hand over the merchandise and stand up." Nia raised an eyebrow, slowly, the movement deliberate. "I have stolen nothing," she said, her voice cool as tempered glass. "And you have no grounds to make that assumption." Marla gave a theatrical gasp. "She's lying!" she cried out, spinning toward the crowd with wide, accusing eyes. "I saw her! I saw her!" The phone in her hand caught the whole moment, broadcasting it live, each second feeding into the growing wave of public humiliation she hoped to stir. Maddox didn't ask for proof. He didn't check the displays or ask the store clerks for confirmation. He didn't glance at the security cameras blinking quietly above their heads. He simply took 2 aggressive steps forward, reaching out and grabbing Nia by the wrist. The suddenness of it sparked a few gasps from the onlookers. A man by the watches lifted his phone and began filming. A teenage girl by the rings turned to her mother, whispering anxiously. The tension splintered the polished air, drawing blood from the illusion of civility the store had carefully built. Nia allowed herself to be pulled to her feet, but the moment Maddox tried to force her wrist behind her back, she shifted slightly, anchoring herself. "You are making a mistake," she said, her tone firm but even. "This can be resolved quietly," Maddox barked, tightening his grip and trying again to wrench her arm. "And yet, you're choosing spectacle," Nia said, still not resisting, but refusing to bend as easily as he expected. Frustrated, Maddox pressed his hand into her shoulder, forcing her down onto a cushioned bench near the display cases. The leather creaked under the abrupt movement. Murmurs grew louder. Phones lifted higher. From her lowered position, Nia remained poised, her breathing steady, her back straight despite the uncomfortable angle. "I advise you," she said, locking eyes with him as he fumbled for his cuffs, "to consider your next actions very carefully." There was a quiet authority in her voice, a command not shouted, but infused into every syllable. It was not a plea. It was not a warning. It was a fact. Maddox sneered, mistaking her calm for arrogance. "You people always think you can talk your way out," he muttered, loud enough for the nearby customers to hear. Several witnesses stiffened. The teenage girl gasped audibly. A man in a tailored suit shook his head in disgust, but said nothing. The weight of the moment grew heavier, each word Maddox spoke etching itself into the collective memory of the crowd. The cuffs clicked around Nia's wrists with a metallic finality. Her hands, now bound, rested lightly against her thighs, her head high. She would not be cowed. Marla zoomed in gleefully on her phone, narrating with a haughty, triumphant tone. "And there you have it," she said, practically glowing. "Another thief thinking she could get away with it." Across the store, the bystanders' expressions shifted, confusion blending with discomfort, some beginning to question the narrative they had been fed. "Is there even proof?" someone muttered near the entrance. "Did she actually take anything?" another voice whispered. Nia caught those words, and a small flicker of vindication stirred in her chest. The truth, inevitable and heavy, was beginning to seep into the cracks. Maddox, oblivious, hauled Nia to her feet with a roughness that bordered on violence. "You're coming with me," he said, dragging her a step toward the door. Nia let him move her, but she turned her head slightly, her voice slicing through the thickening silence around them. "You are arresting the wrong person," she said, steady as a steel beam. "And when this is over, it won't be forgotten." Maddox scoffed, but faltered slightly under her gaze. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. At the far end of the store, unnoticed by most, the glass door swung open again with a soft, controlled click. A tall figure in a crisp charcoal suit strode in, his badge gleaming briefly under the lights. His face shifted from professional neutrality to sudden, sharp recognition as his eyes landed on the woman being forced across the marble floor in cuffs. The tide, though still hidden, was about to turn. Deputy Chief Elias Moreno moved with precision, each step measured but swift, his badge flashing against the muted luxury of the jewelry store. His sharp eyes swept across the scene. Nia Lawson, in handcuffs, being half-dragged by an officer who had no idea who he had just laid his hands on. For a fraction of a second, disbelief tightened Moreno's jaw. Then it vanished, replaced by cold, professional focus. He closed the distance quickly, his voice cutting through the tension before Maddox could shove Nia any farther. "Officer, release her! Now!" The command cracked through the air like a snapped whip. Maddox, startled, jerked his head toward the voice. "Sir, this woman is your commanding officer's commanding officer," Moreno snapped, stepping closer, so there was no mistaking the authority behind his words. "Remove those cuffs immediately." Gasps rippled through the store. Heads whipped around. Marla's hand faltered on her phone. The camera shook briefly as her mind tried to catch up to the unfolding disaster she had helped ignite. Maddox hesitated, his hand twitching toward his belt, caught in the stuttering realization that something had gone horribly wrong. "But she was suspected of—" he started, flailing for control. Moreno didn't let him finish. "You put your hands on Commander Nia Lawson," he said, enunciating each word slowly, coldly, letting the weight of the title settle over every corner of the store. "The highest-ranking SWAT commander in this entire state. And you did it based on the word of a civilian. Without investigation, without evidence, without cause." A heavy, stunned silence fell over the crowd. Even the background music, a soft classical piece floating through the ceiling speakers, seemed to recede under the gravity of Moreno's voice. Maddox paled visibly, his hands fumbling at Nia's wrists. The cuffs clattered awkwardly as he struggled with the key, finally freeing her. Nia stepped back smoothly, rubbing her wrist once with casual detachment, her composure flawless. "Commander Lawson," Moreno said, turning to her with a slight bow of respect, his voice shifting to one of deference. "I deeply apologize for what you've endured. Effective immediately. Officer Maddox is suspended pending full investigation." He turned back to Maddox, his eyes steely. "Hand over your badge and weapon." The murmurs among the crowd grew louder now, outrage threading their voices. "That's her?" someone whispered sharply. "Commander Lawson! She's a hero!" another voice breathed. A man near the door muttered, "He didn't even ask her name." Maddox's hands trembled slightly as he unclipped his badge and firearm, handing them over with a defeated jerk of motion. His face, red and splotchy, showed flashes of disbelief, anger, and fear. Marla, meanwhile, edged toward the wall, her phone still in hand but now trembling visibly. She glanced around the room, realizing too late that the tide she had helped swell was now crashing down, and she was standing directly in its path. Nia looked at Maddox, her gaze even and unflinching. "You treated me like a criminal," she said quietly, "because you thought you could, and you would have treated any other black woman the same way if I hadn't worn this badge." There was no rage in her voice, no raised tone. It was the calm, devastating truth spoken plainly for all to hear. It carried farther than any shouted words ever could have. Moreno stepped in again, clearing his throat. "We will escort Officer Maddox from the premises," he said to the room, but more importantly to the cameras still rolling in several bystanders' hands. "There will be a full investigation. Transparency will be given the highest priority." As Maddox was led away by two uniformed officers Moreno had summoned by radio, Nia remained standing in the center of the store, her posture a monument to dignity. The store manager, white-faced and visibly sweating, stumbled forward. "Commander, please, we didn't know. He stammered. Nia raised a hand, silencing him without a word. She wasn't interested in apologies given out of fear. Not now, not like this. She turned to Moreno. "I want to file an official misconduct report," she said crisply, her voice cutting through the heavy air. "On scene. Now." Moreno nodded immediately, pulling a small tablet from his jacket and opening an internal complaint form. "Of course, Commander," he said, his tone professional but quietly proud. "Include," Nia added, "the store's participation, the civilian's false report, and Officer Maddox's excessive use of force." The store manager blanched even further. Marla's phone finally lowered to her side, her face crumpling into panic as she realized her live stream, still broadcasting, had caught every word, every misstep. Nia gave one final measured glance around the room. She saw the judgment now. Not for her, but for them, for those who had doubted, those who had participated, those who had watched and said nothing. The room that had once pressed its silent hostility onto her now sagged with the weight of shame. Justice had not yet been served, but it had been awakened, and Nia Lawson was not leaving until it roared to life. The fallout from the jewelry store incident hit the local news cycles within hours, clips of the confrontation flashing across television screens and social media feeds like wildfire. Footage captured by bystanders circulated widely, and Marla's original live stream, meant to shame, became evidence against her. Commander Nia Lawson wasted no time. She filed her misconduct report that very evening, then shifted focus to the deeper work. She knew this was bigger than one officer's bias. It always was. 2 days later, sitting in the polished conference room of the Internal Affairs Division, Nia reviewed the initial investigation notes alongside investigator Tasha Rollins. The walls of the room were glass, but the weight of their discussion made the space feel closed and heavy. Tasha, a sharp-eyed woman with a knack for cutting through red tape, slid a file across the table. "You're going to want to see this," she said, her voice low. Nia opened the file carefully. Inside were stills pulled from Marla DeWitt's social media history, financial disclosures, and public records. At first glance, it was standard background. Upscale charity events, gala photos, golf tournaments. But one photograph made Nia's breath catch. There, smiling broadly at a mayor's fundraising dinner, was Marla DeWitt and her husband, Councilman Richard DeWitt, a man who sat not just on the city council but on the Public Safety Oversight Committee, the very body responsible for reviewing police conduct complaints. Nia leaned back in her chair, the air around her seeming to thin. "That explains the confidence," she murmured. Tasha nodded grimly. "It gets worse." She tapped another photo, a smaller group shot taken after a private fundraiser. Standing next to Richard DeWitt, drink in hand and smiling casually, was none other than Officer Trent Maddox. Nia's jaw tightened. "They knew each other." "Better than that," Tasha said. "DeWitt has been one of the biggest opponents of reform proposals, especially anything touching disciplinary procedures. He's lobbied against every major oversight initiative for the past 5 years. Quietly, discreetly, under the radar." A cold realization settled over Nia's shoulders. "This wasn't random," she said. "Marla knew exactly who I was. Or guessed. She didn't just call Maddox because she thought I looked suspicious. She called him because she knew he would act." Tasha leaned in slightly, her voice growing harder. "We dug into the live stream metadata. Marla's account is linked to a private group chat. Guess what? That group has been exchanging videos and photos of black professionals shopping in wealthy districts, sharing locations, warning each other to watch them." Nia closed the file with slow deliberation. The pieces were fitting together in a way that made her stomach knot. A network, a coordinated effort to target, humiliate, and intimidate black professionals, and the police, at least some of them, had been willing participants. "This wasn't about theft," Nia said softly. "It was about presence, about making sure people like me felt watched, unwanted, unwelcome." Tasha nodded again. "And they picked the wrong woman this time." Nia's mind sharpened, all the earlier humiliation hardening into purpose. She thought of all the cases Internal Affairs had reviewed over the years. Cases dismissed for lack of evidence, witnesses discredited, footage mysteriously missing. How many others had been pushed out, arrested quietly, discouraged from pressing charges simply because no one had connected the dots? She rose from her seat, rolling her shoulders back until her full height commanded the room. "We expose them all," she said. "Every officer, every official, every civilian who participated." Tasha's smile was grim but fierce. "I was hoping you'd say that." As they planned the next steps, subpoenas, warrants, quiet interviews, Nia felt the first flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself since the incident. Satisfaction. Not petty, vengeful satisfaction. The kind of satisfaction that came from knowing justice wasn't an abstract concept. It was a blade, and today she would be the one wielding it. Meanwhile, across town, in a private dining room thick with cigar smoke and whispered conversations, Richard DeWitt fielded urgent phone calls from frantic allies. His face, usually flushed with comfortable power, was pale as he listened to the news. Marla sat across from him, her face blotchy and tear-streaked. "I didn't know she was someone important," Marla hissed. "You didn't need to know," Richard snapped. "You were supposed to be careful, quiet, not turn it into a circus." He slammed his hand against the table, making the glasses jump. Now, the cracks they had spent years papering over were starting to split open, and nothing, not power, not money, could hold them together. Not anymore. The Internal Affairs Division was housed in the older wing of headquarters, far from the polished public lobbies and official press rooms. Down here, the walls were bare, the lighting sharp and clinical, humming faintly overhead. It wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to strip everything down to truth, or at least the truth the department allowed to surface. Commander Nia Lawson sat across from Investigator Tasha Rollins, the two women surrounded by towers of case files, arrest records, and incident reports stacked high across the table. Tasha, sleeves rolled up and a pen tucked behind one ear, flipped another folder open. Her brow furrowed deeper with each page she turned. "They thought burying it in paperwork would hide it," she muttered. "But it's all here. They just didn't think anyone would bother connecting the dots." Nia leaned forward, scanning the growing mountain of evidence. Patterns leapt out. An overwhelming majority of arrests involving Black and Latino citizens, petty charges inflated into violent offenses, routine stops escalated into use-of-force incidents. She picked up one report, an arrest made 3 years prior during a supposed disorderly conduct call outside an upscale restaurant. The arrested man had been a corporate lawyer. No charges stuck. No body cam footage survived the investigation. Another file showed a local school principal handcuffed outside a grocery store for suspicious loitering in daylight in his own neighborhood. Each case was another piece in the larger puzzle. A deliberate, targeted campaign of harassment designed to intimidate, isolate, and humiliate. And standing at the center of many of these cases was the same handful of officers. Maddox's name was a frequent visitor to the pages. But he was not alone. Tasha pulled out a chart she had started mapping by hand, the lines and circles webbing out across the paper. "Look at this," she said, tapping the lines. "Maddox, Brenner, Klein, Hoffman, all tied to use-of-force incidents dismissed without consequence. Same reviewing officers each time. And every victim? Black, Latino, or a documented minority business owner." Nia studied the chart in silence. The depth of the corruption was staggering, but it was the predictability that sickened her most. They hadn't even needed to hide their bias. The system had done it for them. "We need to present this to the Oversight Committee," Tasha said, her voice sharp with determination. "Full public hearing. No internal reviews. Full transparency." Nia nodded slowly, but something cold gnawed at the edge of her mind. "If it were that simple," she said, "they would have cleaned this up years ago." No sooner had the words left her mouth than her phone buzzed. She checked the caller ID. "Chief Samantha Greer." Tasha raised an eyebrow as Nia answered, setting the call to speaker. "Commander Lawson." Greer's voice oozed through the line, too smooth to trust. "I've been following the developments regarding Officer Maddox. Impressive work so far." Nia didn't answer immediately. She knew a backhanded compliment when she heard one. "Thank you, Chief," she said flatly. "However," Greer continued, "I'm concerned about the broader implications this investigation might create. We need to be cautious. Public confidence in the department is fragile. Exposing isolated incidents is one thing, but implying a systemic problem." She let the sentence trail off, the implication hanging thick in the air. Tasha rolled her eyes silently across the table. Nia's voice remained even. "We're not implying anything, Chief. We're following the facts." There was a brief pause on the line, a beat too long to be casual. "I'm authorizing a special internal review committee," Greer said finally. "All future investigative actions will need to be coordinated through my office." Nia's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table. Translation. Greer was trying to bottle up the investigation before it spilled into the public eye, before it took down more than just Maddox. "Understood," Nia said, her tone betraying nothing. But as she ended the call, her eyes locked with Tasha's across the table. Neither of them needed to speak to know what came next. They would continue the investigation. But now they were racing against the clock and their own leadership. "We'll need to move faster," Tasha said, sweeping the files into categorized piles. "And smarter. Greer will start quietly shutting doors, burying evidence, pressuring witnesses." Nia nodded. "Then we need to get loud before she can." Outside the walls of internal affairs, the protests still swelled like a living thing, surging through the streets in waves of voices and banners. Inside, Nia Lawson was preparing for a different kind of war. One fought with evidence, strategy, and the cold, steady force of truth, cutting through every lie. They had rattled the foundations. Now, they would tear them down. The city stretched wide beyond the glass windows of Commander Nia Lawson's office, a sprawling maze of rooftops and streets bathed in the gold of a setting sun. the horizon soft and blurred, as if the world itself hesitated on the edge of something inevitable. She sat motionless behind her desk, surrounded by teetering stacks of case files and incident reports that carried the quiet weight of years of concealed injustice, each folder a silent witness to the rot festering just beneath the polished surface of the department she had fought to help shape. Outside, the distant chants of protesters drifted upward, a low, persistent pulse that seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. And as Nia listened, she let the reality settle heavily onto her shoulders. If she pursued this investigation to its rightful end, if she dragged every hidden injustice into the light as the truth demanded, she would not only expose the corrupt network operating within the department, but she might very well collapse the fragile public trust that she and a handful of others had spent their entire careers trying to build. The realization gnawed at the edge of her mind, not with the sharp pain of doubt, but with the slow, grinding ache of a decision that could not be undone once made. And as she leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes against the glare of the sinking sun, her thoughts drifted back to another time, another moment, when the weight of belonging and survival had pressed against her chest like a heavy stone. She remembered her first year at the academy, walking the narrow corridors of the training complex, her footsteps careful, her shoulders straight, the knowledge that she was being watched, stitched into every movement she made. She remembered the instructors who offered half smiles and curt nods, the fellow cadets who chuckled under their breath when she answered questions too quickly, the ones who marveled not at her skill, but at her very presence among them, as if competence in her skin was something rare, something unnatural. She remembered the nights spent alone in the parking lot after long days of drills and evaluations, staring at the city lights in the distance, wondering if the price she was paying, the relentless vigilance, the suffocated anger, the daily calculation of when to speak and when to swallow her pride, was one she could bear for a lifetime. And yet she had stayed. She had stayed because the badge, despite its imperfections, despite the institution it represented, had meant something sacred to her. It had meant protection, service, the chance to be a shield for those who had been left unguarded too long. It had meant hope, not just for herself, but for every black recruit who had entered the academy halls with quiet determination burning in their chests, and for every child who needed to see that justice could wear their face too. Now, as the evidence piled before her and the scale of the corruption became undeniable, she realized the brutal truth. Preserving the illusion of trust would only serve the system that had betrayed its own people, and while tearing it down would invite backlash, scorn, and opportunistic attacks from those eager to twist the narrative. Doing nothing would be the greater betrayal, not just of herself, but of everyone who believed in the ideals she had once sworn to uphold. The decision, though agonizing, crystallized with a clarity that left no room for compromise. Rising from her chair with slow, deliberate movements, Nia crossed the office to the old wooden filing cabinet tucked in the corner, a relic from another era that had somehow survived modernization, and pulled open the top drawer. From within, she retrieved a framed photograph, its edges worn from years of handling, and stared down at the image of herself as a young woman, standing proudly beside her grandfather in front of the small Alabama church where he had marched for civil rights decades before. His hand rested on her shoulder in the picture, steady and sure, his eyes gleaming with the same defiance she felt now stirring anew inside her, and she could almost hear his voice again, rough but warm, the words he had spoken to her when she earned her badge for the first time. "The price of real change is heavy, baby girl. You either carry it with honor, or you leave it for somebody else to bleed under." Closing her eyes briefly, Nia breathed in deeply, the weight of memory anchoring her as she returned to her desk. Setting the frame beside her laptop, she opened the computer, her fingers moving swiftly, gathering reports, cross-referencing names, linking cases, building the framework for the public exposure that would come, whether the department was ready or not. Every entry she made, every piece of evidence she assembled, was another step away from the comfort of silence and toward the painful, necessary birth of something better. Outside, the chants grew louder, more determined, rising into the air like a heartbeat refusing to be silenced. Inside, Nia Lawson pressed forward, unwavering, each keystroke a promise. This time, the truth would not be hidden. This time, there would be no deals behind closed doors, no quiet retirements for guilty men, no erased mistakes filed under administrative error. This time, the walls would fall, no matter how high they had been built. And when they did, she would be ready to build something stronger from the ashes. The night pressed thick against the windows of Nia Lawson's home, the soft hum of crickets filling the humid air with a deceptively peaceful sound. After hours spent compiling evidence, filing preliminary reports, and preparing the investigative case, she welcomed the brief quiet, a chance to exhale without watching every corner of the room. Yet as she stepped onto her front porch, keys in hand, ready to retrieve a folder she had left in the car, her breath caught the moment her gaze swept across the driveway. The soft porch light barely reached the edge of the vehicle, but even in the muted glow, the damage was unmistakable. The front windshield had been shattered, long spiderweb cracks spreading outward like veins of black ice. Both side mirrors hung loosely from their sockets, the glass glittering like frost across the hood. The driver's side door bore the ugliest wound, a hateful slur carved deep into the paint, raw metal gleaming beneath torn layers of enamel. The words, a crude attempt at intimidation, their ugliness sharp against the quiet dignity of the evening. Nia stood still for a long moment, the keys slipping silently into her pocket. She did not curse. She did not weep. Her jaw tightened once, then released. She moved down the steps with the same steady precision she used to approach a breach point in a high-risk operation, her mind cataloging details even as a cold coil of warning wound itself tighter inside her chest. She retrieved her phone and began documenting the damage with meticulous care, snapping wide shots, then close-ups of the keyed message, then the shattered windows, ensuring she captured every detail. Each click of the shutter was deliberate, each step taken without hesitation. She knew exactly what this was meant to be, a message delivered not through confrontation, but through cowardice, a warning that someone or several someones felt the walls closing in and wanted her to think twice about what she was exposing. But fear was a tool she had long ago learned to deny its proper place in her mind. Once satisfied that she had every necessary angle preserved, she dialed Tasha Rollins, lifting the phone to her ear as she turned back toward the house, her shadow long and sharp in the porch light. Tasha answered on the first ring, her voice low but alert. "Commander, my car's been vandalized," Nia said evenly, stepping inside and locking the door behind her, the movement mechanical, practiced. Windows smashed, slurs carved into the side. There was a pause on the line, not of disbelief, but of cold understanding. "You okay?" Tasha asked, the question simple, stripped of unnecessary words. "I'm fine," Nia replied, glancing back through the front window, noting the empty street, the drawn curtains of neighboring houses. No movement, no witnesses, no direct threats yet. Just escalation. Tasha exhaled sharply, the sound heavy with meaning. "This is them," she said. "Silent shields, or whoever's left. They're spooked. They're trying to rattle you." Nia moved through the living room, flipping the locks on the back doors, checking the windows, every movement calm and methodical. She was not paranoid. She was prepared. "They won't stop at property damage," Tasha continued, her voice tightening. "Not if they think you're getting too close to something that could bury them." "I expected the pushback," Nia said quietly, retrieving her backup tablet from the desk, transferring key files to an encrypted drive. They just finally made it visible. There was another brief pause before Tasha spoke again, her voice softer but firm. "You want me to call in extra patrols to swing by tonight?" Nia considered it for a moment, weighing the risks of inviting uniformed officers she might not trust onto her street against the reality that retaliation could escalate further. "No," she said finally. "Not yet. I'm not giving them the satisfaction of knowing they shook me. I'll stay alert, but I want to keep control of this." Tasha didn't argue. She knew Nia well enough to understand when her mind was set. "Then be careful," she said. "Double up your routines. No patterns. Assume you're being watched." "I already am," Nia replied, a faint trace of something close to grim amusement threading through her voice. "They're just too sloppy to do it properly." Tasha laughed softly, the sound dry, battle-worn. "I'll keep digging from my side." Maddox's encrypted email accounts turned up a lead today. Might be something big. Old correspondence between certain department heads. Looks like the same names keep popping up over and over. "Silent Shields," Nia said, the words sliding through her teeth like a blade unsheathed. "Yeah," Tasha confirmed. "And if what I'm seeing is right, it's bigger than we thought. It's not just patrol officers or street cops. This thing has tentacles everywhere. Commanders, supervisors, maybe even people sitting on city committees." Nia leaned against the wall, the coolness of the plaster grounding her, as the enormity of what they were up against stretched wider with each passing hour. "They're desperate," she said. "Which means they're going to make mistakes. We just have to be ready when they do." "And we will be," Tasha said, with a certainty that felt like a lifeline thrown across the growing darkness. "We didn't come this far to fold now." They ended the call shortly after, Tasha promising to send encrypted files to Nia's secure drive by morning. Standing alone in the dim light of her home, Nia listened once more to the quiet outside, her senses stretched taut. Not with fear, but with a sharpened readiness honed by years of surviving hostile environments. The warning etched into the side of her car was meant to frighten her into silence. Instead, it had only hardened her resolve, sharpening her focus to a razor's edge. If Silent Shields thought she would back down now, they had made a mistake far graver than any broken window or slashed tire. They had declared war against a woman who had spent her life learning how to endure, how to fight, and above all, how to win. The night unfolded like an endless stretch of black velvet, the city lights thinning the farther Commander Nia Lawson drove from downtown. She kept to main roads whenever possible, maintaining steady speed, her senses tuned sharply to the rhythm of traffic. It had been a long day of combing through the digital wreckage of Silent Shields, each new revelation a heavier blow than the last. But it was the unease prickling along the back of her neck now that kept her adrenaline from dipping into exhaustion. In her rearview mirror, the same pair of headlights glowed steadily, hovering at an exact, unnatural distance behind her, not close enough to tailgate, not far enough to be random. She had first noticed them near the freeway exit, a black, unmarked sedan pulling onto the road 2 cars behind her. At first, she told herself it might be nothing, paranoia heightened by the earlier vandalism, but after 3 turns, 2 lane changes, and a deliberate detour she had taken into a residential area, the car remained. Patterns mattered. Repetition mattered. Nia's fingers brushed against the small body cam clipped to the inside of her jacket, hidden just behind the lapel. She had activated it the moment she started her drive home. A precaution born not from fear, but from a seasoned instinct honed by years of surviving battles, both seen and unseen. She didn't break pace. She didn't accelerate or slow dramatically, refusing to offer any tells. Instead, she scanned the horizon and caught sight of a bright cluster of lights about a mile ahead. A gas station, still busy even at this hour, its lot filled with trucks and late-night travelers. Without hesitation, she signaled her turn and pulled into the station, easing her car alongside one of the pumps positioned closest to the storefront's well-lit windows. As she stepped out, keeping her movements smooth and unhurried, she didn't have to look far to confirm her suspicions. The black sedan rolled in behind her a few seconds later, parking 2 rows over with an affected casualness that only highlighted the predatory intent behind it. 2 men emerged, both in civilian clothes, but their posture, their clipped strides, and the wary, assessing way they scanned the lot gave them away instantly. Nia recognized the type. Off-duty officers who believed the badge granted them authority no matter where they stood, no matter how far they strayed from the rules. She kept her hands visible, resting lightly on the roof of her car, presenting no threat, offering no excuse for escalation. The men approached at an angle meant to box her in without seeming overt to the casual observer. One was broad and heavy-set, a permanent smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. The other was wiry and sharp-eyed, his fingers drumming against the side of his jeans in a restless rhythm. They stopped a few feet from her, close enough that their voices wouldn't carry far, but far enough to claim plausible deniability. "Evening, Commander," the heavier one said, his voice oiled with mock respect. "Out a little late, aren't we?" Nia tilted her head slightly, her expression smooth, unimpressed. "Is there a reason you're following me?" she asked, her voice calm, clipped, every syllable designed to carry weight without needing to rise in volume. The wiry man chuckled under his breath, low and ugly. "Following? Just happened to be heading the same way. City's not as big as you think when you're working late." The heavy-set one leaned in a fraction closer, lowering his voice to a murmur meant for her ears alone. "Careful, Commander. Lotta accidents happen after dark. Lotta bad luck on lonely roads." It wasn't a threat voiced outright, but it didn't have to be. The intent curdled the space between them, foul and unmistakable. Nia didn't flinch. She didn't reach for her badge or argue, or let them see even the smallest ripple of anger. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly, letting the hidden camera catch the full angle of their faces under the gas station's bright halogen lights. "If you're trying to intimidate me," she said, her tone neutral, almost clinical, "you're wasting both our time." The heavy one shrugged, feigning innocence, but a flicker of frustration crossed his face. "Just friendly advice," he said, tossing a wink at her like he was doing her a favor. Nia's lips curved into a smile so slight it barely lifted the corners of her mouth. "Advice noted," she replied, her voice sharp enough to split glass. Without waiting for them to push further, she turned, re-entered her car with a slow, deliberate movement, and locked the doors with a muted click that echoed louder than a gunshot in the sudden silence between them. As she pulled away, she caught a glimpse of the 2 men standing under the fluorescent lights, watching her leave with thinly veiled irritation. The encounter was over, but the message was received. Both ways, back on the road, Nia felt no fear threading through her veins, only a colder, cleaner kind of certainty. They were scrambling now, trying to rattle her because they understood, too late, that she was beyond intimidation. What they had intended as a warning had only handed her more evidence. 2 officers, off-duty, engaging in coordinated harassment, recorded cleanly and neatly for the record. The clock was ticking down on silent shields, and this time they had made the mistake of thinking the night could hide them. The morning sun had barely edged over the horizon when Commander Nia Lawson pulled into the nearly empty parking lot of the Internal Affairs Division building, her tires crunching softly over the gravel-strewn asphalt. She preferred the early hours lately, before the building filled with bodies and eyes, before whispers could slip too easily between offices, before the tension that now hung over her every step grew thick enough to choke. Stepping inside, she nodded to the lone officer posted at the front desk, bypassing the usual security scans with her department-issued clearance. The halls stretched silent ahead of her, the overhead lights humming their low, constant tune. Her office, tucked neatly on the 2nd floor, should have been untouched, a space that by regulation and policy was protected from tampering without her express permission or a formalized investigation warrant. But the moment she entered, she knew something was wrong. The air had a stillness to it that felt off, too calculated. Her chair was slightly askew, her desk drawer open by a mere crack. Papers subtly shifted out of their carefully ordered stacks. And there, planted squarely in the center of her desk, resting atop a manila folder like an accusation, sat a small black flash drive. Nia closed the door behind her, her eyes scanning the room slowly, methodically. She did not touch the drive. She did not approach the desk. Instead, she stepped backward, withdrawing her phone and opening the secure camera application designed specifically for law enforcement documentation. Every movement she made was recorded, slow, deliberate, ensuring there would be no gaps, no room for later manipulation. Before she could call Tasha Rollins, a sharp knock rapped against the glass. Marcus Elroy, the civilian security supervisor for the building, hovered outside her office, his posture tense, his expression carefully schooled into neutrality. He carried a clipboard under one arm, a heavy set of keys at his belt jangling softly as he shifted his weight. Nia opened the door without inviting him in. "Commander Lawson," Elroy said, clearing his throat awkwardly. "I need to speak with you regarding a matter of departmental concern." Nia said nothing, letting the silence hang until he faltered slightly, eyes darting briefly to the flash drive sitting so conspicuously visible behind her. "A suspicious item was reportedly discovered in your office during routine overnight maintenance," he continued, his tone stilted, reciting words not his own. "For security purposes, I've been instructed to initiate an internal search." "Instructed by whom?" Nia asked, her voice calm, even pleasant, though her muscles coiled with silent fury. Elroy hesitated, an almost imperceptible flicker of fear crossing his face. "Standard protocol, ma'am," he said quickly. "Verbal authorization from administrative command. In other words, no paper trail, no official authorization, no legitimate oversight. They were trying to catch her off guard, to find an excuse, any excuse, to tarnish her record before she could burn theirs to the ground." Nia smiled coolly, stepping fully into the doorway to block Elroy's view inside. "Unfortunately for you," she said, her tone still smooth, "Internal Affairs Procedure 17B requires any search involving command staff to be fully documented under an official evidence handling protocol, complete with external witnesses, body cam recording, time-stamped evidence logs, and independent chain of custody oversight." Elroy's mouth opened, closed, then opened again like a man gasping for air underwater. "Ma'am, I'm sure we can handle this quietly." "No," Nia said, her voice slipping into the iron command that had carried her through battlefield deployments and high-risk raids alike. "We will do this by the book, publicly, transparently. I will not consent to an unauthorized search." Behind the professional facade, Nia could see him recalculating, understanding that the trap they had set for her was already slipping from their fingers. "I'm invoking full procedural protections," she added, stepping backward and snapping photos of Elroy's presence at the door, of the flash drive still untouched on her desk, of the time-stamped security panels visible on the office wall. Every second of delay bought her more proof. Every second made their hastily assembled setup easier to dismantle. Within minutes, the building's on-call legal counsel was summoned. External auditors from headquarters were notified, and 2 uniformed officers were assigned to wear body cams while observing the scene. By the time Elroy finally stepped into the office under full supervision, Nia stood calmly against the far wall, arms folded, her expression unreadable. The flash drive was collected with latex gloves, sealed in an evidence bag, and entered into the official record. Later that afternoon, the forensic report came back faster than expected. The drive contained illegally obtained classified material, and worse, falsified financial records linking Nia to supposed corruption and embezzlement. The files were crude, hastily assembled, littered with errors a real investigator would catch in minutes. Even more damning, security footage confirmed that her office had been clean when she left the night before. The flash drive had been planted during the early morning hours, long after the building was supposed to be locked down, using a stolen master access badge that bypassed normal entry logs. Access to such badges was limited to a handful of people: senior administrators, high-ranking officers, a few trusted security personnel, which meant Silent Shields was not just a loose network of rogue patrolmen. It had teeth high in the chain of command, teeth desperate enough now to risk everything. Standing in the forensic review room, watching the footage frame by frame with Tasha at her side, Nia felt no fear, no hesitation. They had tried intimidation. They had tried sabotage. Now they had tried outright character assassination. Each attempt only confirmed how deeply they feared what she was uncovering. And if they thought these tactics would drive her into silence, they had miscalculated catastrophically. All they had done was hand her more ammunition and expose their desperation for the whole world to see. The following morning, sunlight slanted low across the polished floors of internal affairs. But inside the secure conference room where Commander Nia Lawson and investigator Tasha Rollins worked, the world felt darker, heavier, more charged with quiet urgency than ever before. A dozen evidence folders were spread across the wide oak table, along with a heavy-duty laptop connected to an encrypted forensics server, humming softly in the corner. Tasha's fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, her brow furrowed, the glow of the screen highlighting the tight set of her mouth. She was tracing the latest lead, a recovered email archive that had emerged after the planted flash drive debacle, another careless thread left behind by enemies desperate enough to make mistakes. The silence stretched between them as Tasha cracked the final layer of encryption, a soft beep announcing her success. She leaned back slightly, rubbing her temples once, then gestured for Nia to come closer. "I found it," she said, her voice low, almost reverent with the gravity of it. Or at least, the heart of it. Nia pulled a chair beside her, eyes narrowing as she scanned the open files. At first glance, the emails looked innocuous. Department memos, disciplinary review notes, shift scheduling. But buried deep within the attached files, hidden beneath layers of misleading labels and fabricated timestamps, the real contents unfurled. A network, a formalized system, designed not to catch misconduct, but to erase it. Code-named Silent Shields, the project had been constructed with chilling precision. An internal task force posing as a reform initiative while actually filtering complaints, purging body cam footage, pressuring witnesses, and doctoring evidence whenever necessary to protect valued personnel deemed too important, too connected, or too publicly critical to lose. Tasha scrolled through lists of officers quietly protected under the program. Maddox's name appeared repeatedly. Each use of force incident, each accusation of racial profiling, each complaint tied to excessive force bundled neatly into resolved statuses without explanation. But it was the next revelation that turned Nia's stomach cold. Chief Samantha Greer's name was there too, not just as an overseer, but as an active participant. She had signed off on dismissals, had authorized purges of disciplinary records, had approved the shielding of repeat offenders whose abuses would have otherwise led to immediate termination and criminal charges. She wasn't just tolerating it, Tasha said, her voice edged with disgust. She helped build it. Nia sat back, her mind running through the implications with cold, deliberate focus. The chief of police, the very figurehead the public trusted to steer the department through scandal and reform, had been architect and protector of the corruption festering beneath the surface. Silent Shields hadn't just been an old boys' club operating in the shadows. It had been institutionalized, written into back channels, whispered through command chains, guarded with the full weight of official authority. "She kept them safe," Nia said quietly, her fingers drumming against the table. "Maddox Klein, Brenner, all of them, and every time someone like me tried to push for accountability, they tightened the shields. Tasha clicked into a series of specific communications between Greer and Maddox, dated months before the incident at Sutton and Vale. One email stood out immediately. Greer to Maddox. Keep the usual eyes on high-value targets. Make sure they stay uncomfortable enough to know their place, but don't get sloppy. We can't afford another IA audit. Nia read it 3 times, each pass peeling away another layer of professional detachment until a simmering anger began to harden inside her ribs. They hadn't just been protecting their own. They had been actively orchestrating campaigns of intimidation against citizens, especially black professionals, deemed out of place in wealthy spaces or positions of authority. This was not negligence. This was policy. They tried to destroy you because you didn't fold, Tasha said, closing the laptop gently, as if the weight of the truth might crack the screen if handled too roughly. You scared them because you wouldn't bend like the others. Nia stood, walking slowly to the window, arms folded, gaze sweeping across the city spread below them. Everything she had fought for, every compromise she had made in the hope of changing the system from within, had led to this moment. The stark realization that the rot had not grown despite leadership's efforts, but because of them. For a long minute, she said nothing, letting the truth settle into the marrow of her bones. Then she turned, her voice steady, low, almost gentle, the sound of a woman no longer willing to ask for permission to do what was right. We don't bring them down quietly, she said. We bring them down in the daylight, where everyone can see what they built and what it cost. Tasha nodded, understanding immediately. This is enough to take her to the Oversight Committee, she said. And if we leak portions of it strategically to the press first, they won't be able to contain it, Nia finished, a faint grim smile touching her lips. Silent shields will die under the same spotlight they spent years trying to avoid. They set to work immediately, drafting summary reports, compiling timelines, cross-referencing names, and building a dossier so airtight that even the most desperate counterattacks would falter against its sheer density of fact. They knew Greer would not go down quietly. They knew Maddox's remaining allies would fight, would scramble, would try to tear them apart if they could. But the evidence was a blade honed sharp now, and Nia was no longer in the business of dulling her edge for anyone. The morning air carried the sharp tang of anticipation as Commander Nia Lawson made her way into the discreet cafe tucked between an old bookstore and a shuttered tailor shop, the kind of place that had been forgotten by the city's gleaming redevelopment plans and so remained invisible to the casual passerby. She slid into the booth tucked into the farthest corner, the cracked leather seats offering the quiet kind of familiarity that made conversations dangerous to the powerful. Across from her sat Brandon Cole, a journalist with a reputation for precision and persistence, a man who had built his career not on sensationalism, but on careful, methodical exposure of the stories the public was never supposed to hear. He wore a simple black jacket, a worn press badge tucked into his shirt pocket, and an expression of quiet readiness that matched Nia's own. The flash drive she carried was small, almost weightless, yet as she placed it between them on the table, it seemed to hum with the gravity of what it contained. Brandon didn't reach for it immediately. "You're sure about this?" he asked, voice low, the words heavy not with doubt, but with the full understanding of what they were about to unleash. Nia nodded once, the decision long since made. "You'll get a controlled leak," she said, "enough to trigger national attention. Enough to corner the department into public accountability without jeopardizing the formal indictments we're building." Brandon offered a grim smile, understanding the delicate balance they were about to walk, the careful dance of exposing corruption without handing Silent Shield's a legal loophole to slither through. "I'll publish it in layers," he said. "Build public pressure before they have time to spin it. Verified documents, cross-checked sources, nothing they can dismiss as rumor." "Good," Nia said, sliding the drive across the table. "Timing is critical. Release within 48 hours. Focus on the core. Silent Shield's existence, the protection of abusive officers, and Chief Greer's involvement. Brandon tucked the drive away without fanfare, his hands steady. "They won't know what hit them," he said. By the next morning, the first wave broke across the city like a storm surge. Headlines screamed from every corner of the internet and television screens. Secret police network protected abusive officers, internal records reveal. Commander Lawson's investigation uncovers deep corruption in city police department. Chief of police implicated in Silent Shield scandal. The public response was immediate and ferocious. Protests, already steady outside Sutton and Vale Jewelers and the courthouse, swelled in size, blocking streets, flooding city squares with banners and chants that echoed through the concrete canyons. Social media exploded with fury and disbelief, hashtags demanding resignations and criminal charges climbing into trending lists within hours. Inside the department, panic spread faster than any press release could contain. Silent Shield's members, long accustomed to operating with impunity, began to realize the ground beneath them was collapsing. Officers who had once stood smug and silent now scrambled for cover, some resigning abruptly under the thin excuse of personal reasons, others quietly emptying their desks late at night, hoping to disappear before the subpoenas reached their front doors. Memos leaked almost immediately, showing desperate attempts by mid-level commanders to distance themselves from the network, issuing denials, retroactively amending personnel records, shredding non-essential files in locked offices long after official work hours had ended. It didn't matter. The investigation had already mapped their involvement with chilling precision. Each desperate move only confirmed their guilt. And Chief Samantha Greer, the architect of Silent Shields, found herself increasingly isolated within the fortress she had spent years constructing. The mayor, once a vocal supporter, issued a carefully worded statement expressing grave concern and promising a full and independent review. City council members who had accepted her private endorsements began issuing statements calling for accountability and transparency. Even the police union, sensing the shifting winds, offered no defense beyond a vague promise to cooperate with ongoing investigations. Inside internal affairs, Nia and Tasha worked around the clock, coordinating with federal agents and external auditors who had been quietly summoned under emergency authorization. Every name, every falsified report, every erased disciplinary action was compiled into a master file, a living monument to the lies that had been woven into the fabric of the department for far too long. Late one evening, as Nia leaned over a table scattered with files and diagrams, Tasha entered the room, a small smirk playing at the edge of her mouth. "You're going to want to see this," she said, tossing a thin folder onto the table. Nia flipped it open. Inside were records of internal communications, panicked emails between Silent Shield's members discussing their next moves, desperate offers to trade information for immunity, clumsy attempts to blame lower-ranking officers for decisions made at the highest levels. "They're turning on each other," Tasha said. "Greer's inner circle is fracturing faster than we predicted." Nia allowed herself a rare, brief smile. It wasn't the end yet, not even close, but it was the first clear crack in the armor they had been chipping at for so long. "They know it's over," Nia said, straightening the folder neatly atop the growing pile of evidence. "Now, it's just a matter of who falls first, and how hard." Across the city, lights burned late in government offices, legal firms, and private homes where men and women once shielded by Silent Shields now faced a future defined not by power, but by fear. For years they had operated in darkness, believing themselves invisible, invincible. Now, with the truth dragging them out into the daylight, they had nowhere left to hide. The courthouse steps gleamed under the late afternoon sun, a stage set for reckoning as reporters jostled for position, microphones thrust forward like bayonets, their voices rising in a chaotic chorus of questions no one dared to answer yet. Inside the grand stone building, where justice was often whispered in back rooms rather than declared from pulpits, something different was unfolding, something raw, something visible, something undeniable. Commander Nia Lawson stood just inside the hallway, arms folded across her chest, the steady hum of her breathing the only sound anchoring her, amid the swelling tide of noise beyond the heavy oak doors. Beside her, Tasha Rollins adjusted the folder clutched in her hands, thick with affidavits, documented abuses, and the long-buried truths they had dragged into the light. Down the hall, Trent Maddox sat stiffly at a defense table. His usual swagger evaporated, leaving only a man who understood too late that the system he believed would protect him had finally broken its silence. His uniform, once pressed and gleaming with undeserved authority, now hung awkwardly off his frame, the badges stripped away, the weight of public hatred bearing down with every breath he took. The district attorney's voice rang sharp and clear as the charges were read aloud, each one a brutal incision into the myth of Maddox's invincibility: excessive use of force, falsification of arrest reports, tampering with evidence, conspiracy to obstruct justice. Each accusation built upon the last, the list stretching on with clinical precision, every name of every victim enunciated carefully, no longer lost to the indifferent bureaucracy that had once shielded him. When the final charge was read, a hush fell across the courtroom so complete that Nia could hear the soft rustle of pages turning in the gallery. Maddox kept his head low, refusing to meet her eyes, his hands clenched into pale fists atop the table, a silent admission of a man who knew the battle was no longer his to fight. Across town, the fallout continued to spread. Marla DeWitt's name had surfaced alongside Maddox's in the first wave of investigative reports released to the public, and while her crimes had not been violent, the civil lawsuits filed against her carried their own kind of devastation. Video footage from the jewelry store, once smugly filmed by Marla herself, played on endless loops across news stations and social media. The sharp, unmistakable voice of privilege and malice laid bare for millions to witness. Defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, civil conspiracy to commit racial discrimination. The lawsuits came swiftly, each one another blow to the DeWitt family's carefully curated image. Within days, Marla found herself banned from Sutton and Vale and other high-end establishments that once welcomed her with open arms. Her social circles shrank with almost comical speed, as acquaintances and friends fled to distance themselves from the sinking ship. The city's mayor, under intense public scrutiny, issued a formal apology to Nia and announced sweeping new mandates for police accountability, civilian review boards, and transparency reforms, trying to stem the rising anger that threatened to upend the next election cycle. Nia, for her part, accepted none of the platitudes. She needed no polished words from men and women who had once looked the other way. Her victory was not symbolic. It was tangible, rooted in the concrete reality of consequences finally falling where they belonged. As she exited the courthouse later that day, the crowd outside parted almost instinctively. A sea of faces filled with something she rarely saw pointed toward her. Not pity, not skepticism, but profound respect. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward again, but this time the shouts carried a different tone. Commander Lawson, what's next for Silent Shields? Do you think Chief Greer will be indicted? How does it feel to see justice finally being served? Nia paused at the top of the stairs, the city sprawling behind her, chaotic and vibrant and raw. She could have answered easily, could have thrown out carefully crafted words meant to satisfy headlines without offending fragile egos. Instead, she chose truth, plain and unvarnished. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice steady, carrying effortlessly over the crowd. "Justice doesn't end with a few indictments. It ends when the systems that protected them are dismantled and rebuilt the right way. We are not finished." She turned without waiting for further questions, moving with the same deliberate grace that had carried her through battles far more dangerous than microphones and flashing cameras. Tasha fell into step beside her, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "You just made the evening news again," she said lightly. "Good," Naya replied, allowing the smallest hint of a smile to touch her lips. "Let them hear it. Let them all hear it." Across the street, protest banners waved in the warm breeze, the chants still rising strong. Demands not just for retribution, but for true change, the kind that could not be papered over with new slogans or empty committees. Behind her, the courtroom doors swung open again, and another figure stumbled out into the glare of public judgment. Marla DeWitt, shielded behind oversized sunglasses and a hastily thrown-on scarf, her posture small and shrunken under the weight of the world she had once so casually weaponized against others. There would be no redemption arc for her, no quiet retreat into comfortable anonymity. Her disgrace would be as public as her arrogance had been. As Nia crossed the plaza, the sun warming her back, she felt not triumph, but a deep, anchored sense of rightness. The knowledge that real justice was messy, imperfect, and often incomplete. But when fought for with enough courage, it carved its own indelible mark on the world. And, for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe, not in the system as it had been, but in what it could still become. The office of the Chief of Police sat at the top of headquarters like a throne room carved from glass and steel, a monument to authority built on the illusion of transparency. From the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled in every direction, a glittering expanse of streets and lights. But inside the thick silence of the room, the air was dense with something heavier than power, the looming inevitability of a reckoning. Commander Nia Lawson stood in the center of the room, calm and composed, the evidence files she carried tucked neatly under one arm. Her gaze did not waver as Chief Samantha Greer rose slowly from behind her heavy oak desk, her movements deliberate, as though she could somehow slow the tide that had been rushing toward her since the moment silent shields began to unravel. Greer's expression was tight, her lips pressed into a hard line, her jaw set with the stubborn pride of someone who had ruled without question for far too long, and now found herself dragged unwillingly into a confrontation she could no longer control. "You've made quite the mess, Commander," Greer said finally, her voice sharp but brittle, cracking at the edges despite her efforts to maintain composure. Nia tilted her head slightly, the ghost of a smile flickering across her lips, not of amusement, but of understanding. "I didn't make the mess," she said softly. "I just refused to keep sweeping it under the rug." Greer's eyes narrowed, a flash of something darker crossing her face. Anger, resentment, fear. She crossed her arms over her chest, the badge on her breast gleaming under the office lights, a symbol she had long since corrupted into little more than a shield for her own ambition. "I suppose you're here to demand my resignation," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "No," Nia replied, stepping forward, placing the folder carefully on the edge of Greer's desk like a laid weapon. "I'm here to offer you a choice." She opened the folder with a single movement, spreading the already infamous evidence across the polished surface, each page a mirror to Greer's choices. The proof was undeniable, but Nia wasn't here to rehash it. She was here to watch how Greer faced the fall she had built with her own hands. "You can step down quietly," Nia said, her voice steady, unyielding. "Effective immediately. No fanfare, no last-minute press conferences, a carefully worded retirement statement citing personal reasons. You walk away while you still have the illusion of dignity." Greer's hands twitched slightly at her sides, a betraying crack in her otherwise rigid mask. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though the answer already weighed heavy between them. "Then the full case goes public," Nia said without hesitation. "Every file, every recording, every statement. We will make sure the world sees exactly how far you were willing to go to protect abusers, to destroy good officers who stood in your way, to target civilians who didn't fit your definition of acceptable." She let the words hang there, filling the space between them with their full, devastating promise. Greer's fists clenched and unclenched, her breath coming in tight, shallow bursts as she struggled against the reality she could no longer rewrite. "You think you've won?" she spat, venom lacing every syllable. "You think tearing this department apart makes you a hero?" Nia leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper, cutting sharper than any shout. "I didn't tear the department apart. You did. The moment you decided that protecting your power was more important than protecting the people we swore to serve." For a moment, the silence in the room felt like a living thing, stretching taut between them. Then Greer laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that held no real amusement. "You think they'll let you rebuild anything?" she sneered. "You think they'll thank you for showing them how broken it all was? They'll turn on you, Lawson. They always do. You'll be the villain before the dust even settles." Nia's gaze never faltered. "Maybe," she said, "but at least I'll know I did what was right." Greer turned away, staring out the window as if the city could offer her salvation, as if denial could erase the noose tightening around her neck. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Nia watched the proud woman grapple with the end she had earned, but never believed would come. Finally, Greer spoke, her voice low, bitter. "I won't resign," she said. "You want a war, Commander? You'll get one." Nia nodded once, unsurprised. She gathered the folder back into her arms with a calm efficiency, her movements slow, deliberate. "Then prepare yourself, Chief," she said, "because the walls are already closing in." Without another word, she turned and walked from the office, the heavy door swinging shut behind her with a final, echoing thud. As she made her way down the hall, faces turned to meet her. Uniformed officers, civilian staff, fellow investigators, and in their expressions, she saw it clearly. The shift, not fear, not suspicion, respect, solidarity, a quiet, growing defiance against the regime that had ruled them through silence and intimidation. Tasha met her at the elevator, a phone already in hand, ready to signal the final phase of the exposure. "She's refusing," Nia said simply, not needing to elaborate. Tasha smiled grimly. "Good. It'll be that much sweeter when the public sees her dragged down kicking and screaming." The elevator doors slid open, and they stepped inside together, the hum of energy around them electric, unstoppable. In the building below, allies rallied. Investigators who had once kept their heads down, now lifting their gazes. Officers long intimidated into silence, now finding their voices again. The tides had turned, and no shield, silent or otherwise, would save the guilty now. The courtroom was packed, the heavy wooden pews creaking under the weight of officers, reporters, and civilians drawn to the grand jury hearing that had become the center of the city's attention. Tension vibrated in the air, sharp and electric, as everyone waited for the moment when Trent Maddox, the man once shielded by power and silence, would finally face the reckoning he had so long evaded. Commander Nia Lawson sat near the front, her posture composed, her face unreadable as she watched the proceedings unfold. Across the aisle, Maddox sat with his defense team, their suits crisp, their faces grim, the weight of mounting evidence pressing down heavier than any uniform he had ever worn. The district attorney moved methodically, laying out the charges. A pattern of abuse stretching back nearly a decade, falsified reports, tampered evidence, coerced witnesses, all linked with a chain of documented proof so thorough that even the most skeptical juror would have found little room for doubt. Outside the courthouse, protesters held banners high in the brisk morning air, their chants threading faintly through the thick stone walls, a reminder that the world was watching, that justice was no longer a whispered ideal, but a roaring demand. But as the hearing stretched into its second hour, a shift occurred. The defense team, led by a smirking, sharp-suited lawyer whose confidence seemed misplaced, given the mountain of evidence against them, called an unexpected witness, a uniformed officer, one of Greer's old loyalists, one whose name had appeared more than once on Silent Shield's internal communications. There was a ripple of unease through the gallery. Nia's jaw tightened as she recognized the move for what it was, a desperate ploy. Greer, refusing to go down quietly, was trying one last time to salvage herself and her network by dragging Nia into the mud. The officer took the stand, swearing in with barely concealed nervousness, and began to spin a narrative, a fabrication claiming that Nia had been aware of Silent Shields all along, that she had benefited from the system, that she was simply using the scandal to consolidate power for herself. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Cameras clicked frantically from the press section. Nia remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable, though her mind worked fast and cold, remembering every precaution she and Tasha had taken, every document catalogued, every communication backed up on independent servers beyond the reach of Greer's loyalists. The district attorney rose with slow, deliberate movements when the officer finished his carefully rehearsed lies. "Commander Lawson," the prosecutor said, turning toward her with a slight nod, "may we present the independent evidence review you submitted to the committee 2 weeks prior to the exposure of Silent Shields?" Nia stood smoothly, passing forward the sealed evidence packet, notarized, time-stamped, unassailable. The bailiff accepted it, delivering it to the judge, who reviewed the contents silently before passing it to the jury foreman. Inside were the original reports Nia had filed, the complaint documents submitted through official and unofficial channels, the ignored warnings, the formal protests she had made long before the scandal had ever seen daylight. And there, laid bare in black and white, was the proof. Not only had Nia not benefited from Silent Shields, she had actively tried to expose misconduct, facing resistance and retaliation every step of the way. The defense attorney paled visibly as the evidence was read aloud, the narrative Greer had so desperately constructed collapsing under the sheer weight of verifiable fact. The officer on the stand shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading at his temple as he realized the trap he had walked into, the perjury he had just committed, the criminal liability he had foolishly accepted in an effort to protect a sinking ship. The prosecutor pounced without mercy, dismantling the false testimony piece by piece, until even the faintest suggestion of Nia's involvement in corruption was shredded beyond recovery. By the time the officer was dismissed, his credibility in tatters, his future uncertain, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Now all eyes turned to Maddox again, to the undeniable evidence of his abuses, to the crumbling facade of power that could no longer shield him from the truth. When the foreman of the jury stood, the air seemed to freeze. Maddox was indicted on all major counts: falsifying official reports, using excessive force causing bodily harm, conspiring to obstruct justice, and tampering with evidence. The list continued, each word a hammer blow against the empire Maddox and his protectors had built, each declaration stripping away another layer of the illusion that had allowed so much suffering to go unanswered for so long. When the final indictment was read, the tension in the courtroom shattered into a roar of reaction. Gasps, cries, a scattering of applause quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. But the sound was enough. Outside, the news hit within minutes, flashing across screens and phone alerts, setting the crowd to cheers that shook the very steps of the courthouse. Nia rose from her seat slowly, the folder clutched lightly in her hand, feeling not triumph, but something deeper, the satisfaction of knowing that for once the machine of justice had turned in the right direction, even if only because she and others had forced it to. Tasha caught up with her at the back of the courtroom, her grin wide despite the exhaustion lining her face. "That was beautiful," she said, bumping Nia's shoulder lightly. You crushed them. Nia allowed herself a small, tired smile. No, she said. The truth did. We just refused to let them bury it. And as she stepped into the sunlight outside, the chants rising like a tide around her, she understood that what they had built here would not be easy to erase. Not this time. Not ever again. The days that followed unfolded like the slow unfurling of a long-awaited storm. The dark clouds of secrecy finally split open by the relentless, searing light of exposure. Across every news channel, every headline, every public forum, the story of Silent Shields unraveled in front of the world, with a brutal clarity no spin or distraction could deflect. Internal Affairs released its full report to the public, a thick, meticulously documented accounting of years of misconduct, suppression, and systemic corruption. Names were listed plainly, without euphemism or protection, each tied to specific abuses, each a piece of the machinery that had quietly crushed justice under the weight of self-preservation. The network that had operated behind closed doors was dismantled methodically, every thread of influence pulled into the open. Officers who had once moved through the ranks with impunity were suspended, investigated, or forced to resign, their careers collapsing under the sudden and unstoppable tide of accountability. Civil suits flooded the courts, led by victims who had once been silenced, their voices now amplified by public outrage and undeniable evidence. Department officials scrambled to answer for failures long ignored, while citizen watchdog groups gained unprecedented access to records that had previously been shielded from scrutiny. Trent Maddox faced his sentencing with none of the defiance he had once wielded so easily. Found guilty not only for the attack at Sutton and Vale, but for a long history of abuses, his fate was sealed by the sheer weight of testimony, video footage, and falsified reports unearthed during the investigation. Stripped of his badge, his pension, and his freedom, he was escorted out of the courtroom under heavy guard, his final expression one of hollow defeat. In another corner of the city, Marla DeWitt endured her own downfall. Civil judgments piled against her name, draining her once vast resources. No longer welcome in the country clubs and charity circles that had once celebrated her, she lived under a cloud of lawsuits and public disdain. Her carefully polished image shattered beyond repair, Marla faced a future marked not by privilege, but by the heavy burden of disgrace and financial ruin. As the fallout continued, the former chief of police, Samantha Greer, became the most prominent symbol of the broken system. Her termination was swift and final, delivered during a televised press conference where the mayor outlined the extent of her complicity in the conspiracy. Greer's attempts to deny her role crumbled under the mountain of evidence laid before the public. Her past political allies, once eager to align themselves with her reputation, withdrew their endorsements without ceremony. The interviews that had once heralded her as a visionary leader vanished, replaced by editorials condemning her failures. The shield of power she had built over decades did not withstand the weight of truth, leaving her reputation hollowed out and exposed to the very public she had manipulated for so long. Meanwhile, reforms swept through the department with a speed and ferocity rarely seen in the city's long and troubled history. New mandates made body cameras mandatory and tamper-proof. An independent civilian review board, composed of activists, legal experts, and retired judges, was granted full oversight authority over internal investigations. Policies protecting whistleblowers were strengthened, ensuring that future misconduct could not be hidden so easily behind closed doors. Through it all, Commander Nia Lawson remained a steady presence, not seeking accolades or political gain, but working tirelessly to ensure that real, lasting change rooted itself deep into the foundations of law enforcement. She met with community leaders, testified before oversight panels, and helped draft new protocols that emphasized transparency and accountability at every level. It was not a swift or simple healing. The city bore scars from the revelations, wounds not easily stitched together by press conferences or reform bills. But the difference was palpable. There was an acknowledgement now of what had been allowed to fester in the dark, and with acknowledgement came the first real steps toward repair. Late one evening, standing outside the newly established Civilian Accountability Center, Nia watched the city breathe under the wide, clear sky. Tasha joined her, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee, and they leaned against the railing in companionable silence. "Think it'll stick this time?" Tasha asked after a long moment, her voice carrying both hope and the battle-weariness of someone who had seen too many promises fade before. Nia took a slow sip of her coffee, eyes scanning the skyline where protest banners still fluttered in the breeze, and murals honoring truth-tellers had begun to replace old walls of silence. "It will," she said simply, "because too many people are watching now, because too many of us fought to make sure they can't pretend not to see anymore." In the distance, the city lights shimmered like scattered embers, not dying, but glowing steadily, ready to ignite something new. And as the night deepened, Nia knew that even though the battle had been brutal, even though the cost had been high, it was a fight worth every scar left behind. Justice, real justice, was not a single moment or a single victory. It was a lifetime of standing, of speaking, of refusing to be silent, no matter the cost. And she would carry that torch forward, no matter how long it took, no matter how heavy it sometimes felt. Because now, at last, the silence was broken. The soft murmur of conversation drifted through the elegantly lit interior of Sutton and Vale Jewelers, the polished marble floors and gleaming glass cases pristine once again. Yet the air tonight carried a different kind of weight, one built not from opulence, but from remembrance. A private ceremony had been organized, unpublicized except among a small, carefully chosen group of attendees. Community leaders, activists, law enforcement officials, and the senior management of the store, who now understood that apology alone was never enough. Action had to follow. In the center of the main hall, beneath a canopy of soft golden lights, stood the unveiled plaque, newly installed along the western wall. Crafted in bronze, understated yet impossible to miss, it bore simple but powerful words, in acknowledgement of past injustice, and in commitment to a future of equality and dignity for all. Let what happened here never be repeated. Commander Nia Lawson stood among the gathered crowd, her hands resting loosely in front of her, her expression composed, reflective. She wore no uniform tonight, no badge polished to gleam under the lights. There was no need. Her presence alone spoke more powerfully than any title ever could. Executives from the store gave brief, humble speeches, acknowledging their failures and committing resources toward racial equity initiatives in the city. Promises were made, but this time Nia could feel the difference. There was weight behind the words, real pressure from a community that had learned not to let accountability end at apologies. When offered the chance to speak, Nia declined with a gentle shake of her head, preferring to let the moment stand on its own, without fanfare or personal glory. She remained quietly at the edge of the ceremony, watching as others approached the plaque, reading it carefully, some pausing longer than others, their faces thoughtful, some remorseful, some quietly grateful. There was no grand applause, no flashing cameras, no orchestrated celebration, and Nia preferred it that way. Real change was rarely born in explosions of noise. It was built slowly, quietly, on the backs of those willing to shoulder the burden without expectation of reward. Tonight, the true victory lay not in recognition, but in the acknowledgement that the system had shifted, however slightly, because someone had demanded that it must. As the ceremony wound down, Nia stepped closer to the plaque, tracing its lines with her gaze, letting the moment settle in her bones. She thought of the first time she had walked into this building, the suspicion, the humiliation, the heavy hand on her shoulder forcing her down without cause. She thought of how easy it would have been to leave it there, to walk away, to protect herself by doing nothing. But justice was never about ease. It was about endurance, about standing firm even when the ground seemed determined to swallow you whole. A soft voice pulled her from her reverie. "Commander Lawson?" She turned to find a young woman standing nearby, dressed in a neatly pressed academy uniform, the dark blue still slightly stiff from newness. She was no older than 22, her posture straight, her eyes clear, a mix of reverence and determination shining through her nervous smile. "I just wanted to say thank you," the young woman said quickly, her hands gripping the folder at her side like a lifeline. "Because of you, because of everything you did, I believe I can make a difference too." Nia smiled, genuine and warm, the kind of smile that came not from pride, but from recognition, the passing of something fragile and vital from one set of hands to another. "You will," Nia said simply, "and when it gets hard, and it will, remember why you started." The young woman nodded fiercely, her chin lifting with quiet courage before she turned and disappeared into the departing crowd, the future already pulling her forward. As the room emptied, Nia lingered a moment longer before stepping outside into the crisp evening air. Across the city, signs of rebuilding flickered like cautious beacons. Community meetings, once sparsely attended, now crowded with voices eager to shape new policies. Training academies rewriting their core curriculum to include bias education, and ethics courses led by independent experts. Patrol officers forming outreach programs in neighborhoods long neglected or mistreated. Public trust, battered and bruised, did not heal overnight, but it showed signs of mending, thread by deliberate thread. And Nia, no longer the silent force behind the change, but its quiet architect, took her place not on stages or behind microphones, but in the training rooms, the community centers, the back offices where the next generation of officers, advocates, and leaders waited for someone willing to teach them how to hold the line when the storms inevitably came. She mentored them not with grand speeches, but with real lessons, hard truths, and an unwavering belief that they could and must do better than the generations that came before. Justice had been served. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly. And as Nia walked into the night, the city stretching wide and unfinished before her, she carried with her the one thing that no force, no silence, no shield could ever take away: the unshakable certainty that real change was not only possible, but inevitable, so long as there were those willing to demand it. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.